Hey, it's me, Rob Bryan, and I am back with another incredible episode of Entrepreneurial Thinkers. If you are an entrepreneur, investor, just an entrepreneurial thinker, a leader of any sort across any segment here in Southern California, this is an episode that you're going to want to listen to as I interview Andy Wilson, the executive director, now outgoing executive director and about to be former CEO of the Alliance for SoCal Innovation. We dive into all that is unfolded in his journey, his 9-company starting career, and all the lessons learned from that. We talk about relationships, we talk about networking, we talk about building networks of people, we talk about consensus building, and we also talk about what he's about to go do after he gets back from his holiday trip. If you're an entrepreneur or an investor or an entrepreneurial thinker in the world at large, and you want to learn how to build entrepreneurial ecosystems, how to find your place inside of vibrant, sustainable entrepreneurial ecosystems, if you want to tap into some of the lessons learned from one of the most prolific relationship builders and how to build your networks and how to build relationships in a sustainable and impactful way, this is an episode that you want to enjoy. So I hope you tap into it, listen to it, and enjoy it as much as Andy and I did making it for you. Hola, hello, hi, bienvenido, and welcome back or welcome to Entrepreneurial Thinkers. As you know, if you listen, this is a show where I get to have weekly conversations with the best and brightest entrepreneurial thinkers across all sectors and segments of society and industry as we come together to try to leave this world just a little bit better than we found it. Today, I'm super excited, frankly, just grateful to be joined by one of the true OG leaders here in the Los Angeles area, my friend Andy Wilson, the executive director of the Alliance for SoCal Innovation. Andy's a dynamic force in Southern California's economic and cultural political landscape. Though his impact is deep and his reach is wide over the last 30 years, he delivers everything that he injects into our community in a really easygoing, humble, smart, but calming demeanor that kind of belies his fiery passion and his real strength. As executive director and CEO of the Alliance for SoCal Innovation, and before in many various private and public sector roles, he has continually championed entrepreneurship, technology, and community growth. With a career that has spanned executive leadership across many high-growth companies, including some good old standard companies that some of us probably remember, many of us may have forgotten, like R.R. Donnelley and Yahoo, some venture acceleration with firms such as Momentum Venture Management and Vicente Capital Partners, and of course, public service in many capacities, including his time as a city council member and vice mayor of the city of Pasadena, and now most recently as a commissioner of my beloved Hollywood Burbank Airport that I love to fly out of. Andy is deeply committed to building vibrant communities that drive regional progress and really tackle pressing challenges. From his time studying at Dartmouth way back when and the Harvard Business School to launching Innovate Pasadena, mentoring startups and investors alike, his work continues to blend his personal and industrial innovation with a passion for leaving the world, as we say here at our show, just a little bit better than he found it. As you can imagine, I believe Andy epitomizes the profile of the modern entrepreneurial thinker that we had in mind when we launched this new thesis of our show last year. So I'm super grateful to say, welcome to Entrepreneurial Thinkers, Andy. It's great to have you here.
Thanks, Rob. And hearing that intro, you made me feel older than I really am. How could anyone possibly do all that stuff? And I'm still doing new things.
You have more hair than I do, and less of it is gray. So I think you're doing just fine, right?
It's all that good California red wine. It keeps my tannins and my heart healthy. So, but it's always great to be here, and I love spending time with you.
100%. Thank you very much. I said it was a thought that triggered my reaching out to you to invite you onto the show. Was that it's almost about a year ago that we got together and had a really nice lunch before the holidays in Los Feliz. This year, you're going to be off. You were telling me off air, you're going to be off on an amazing adventure in New Zealand for the holidays. So that's incredible. But I'm grateful that you have time to share with us today. We've got some big news we're going to talk about in a minute. But before we do that, I want to dive right into just this topic, right? And as the synergy between kind of, if someone was to read your LinkedIn bio and then read my description of our show, is incredible because you may be the only other person that I knew that really uses the phrase entrepreneurial thinking. And I think it's such an apt descriptor of you and your career, but of also just kind of the wider entrepreneurial economy and the world at large that we play in. So I want to ask you right out of the gate, right? Like you have this really unique combination across public, private, and nonprofit sectors. Tell me why you think entrepreneurial thinking is so critical to all of our collective evolution and progress?
Yeah, great question. And I do drink the Kool-Aid in terms of entrepreneurial thinking. And I think about it as kind of a mindset, honestly. For those of us who've been in the startup ecosystem and kind of founders and innovators, we are extreme optimists. I kind of live my life. And it doesn't mean we're not realists, honestly. We know what, is out there and how dangerous the real world is. But if you're not kind of brave enough to imagine a reality that's better and kind of take a leadership position in making that reality come to life, then we're all kind of screwed. And so I'm committed to making our world better for ourselves and for our children and, people around us in our communities. So I wake up thinking about what can I do proactively to kind of look at what people see as problems. I see as kind of opportunities to find solutions.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit of a curse in some ways. Like people are complaining, and especially you can imagine my time in elected office. Sometimes you can be the complaint department, but I always kind of saw those as kind of cues and kind of road posts to where opportunity exists, and it kind of makes life a lot better in the sense that you could wake up and say, "Oh my God, all this stuff sucks." Instead, I'm like, "Oh, I have agency. What can I do to kind of tackle some of these problems?" And I look at, the things I've done, whether it be, say, in the private sector, in community work and kind of agencies. It's always thinking about, what can we do when there's challenges in front of us or things that are not working the way we want? How do we find paths forward? And I know we're going to talk later about in those different environments, like those paths are some ways similar and some ways different. There is, kind of common threads through them, but contextually, the stakeholders and how you get things done and how bold you can be tend to vary depending on what environment you're in. But for me, it's about optimism, and not to get political, but
it's okay. We can get political on this show. I don't mind it.
Okay, good. I mean, I like people who, rather than saying world sucks and, we're screwing things up, it's like, let's bring the power of positive thinking, collaboration, and creativity forward to kind of make the world a better place.
Yeah.
And the more you focus on the negativity, the less energy you have to make it a better place. So I rather kind of flip that on its head and to turn that into positive energy. And I'm certainly realistic enough to know that many of these ventures don't necessarily succeed. But, you'll never succeed unless you try, and approaching those challenges with a positive attitude and creativity, you'll surprise yourself with some of the outcomes you achieve.
100% true. And thank you for that. I would double down on everything you said, right? I for probably 15 years or so, when I kind of realized it about myself, I started referring to myself as being a pragmatic optimist, right? And the way I define that for people who ask me, like, what does that mean, right? Like, you're just optimistic all the time. Yeah, I said, but I'm very aware of all the conditions on the ground around me, right? But then I choose to lean into what's possible, right? And I've said for, again, 15, 20 years that to me is like a fundamental trait of any entrepreneur or investor, right? Who aspires to any level of success or sustainable success. But I love that you extrapolated out and you said it's essentially kind of applicable to just about anybody.
Yeah. It's a mindset. And it's just the way when I wake up in the morning, and like you could wake up in taking a different view, and that's not the way I want to wake up in the morning. I'd be kind of pretty depressed.
Yeah.
So I choose intentionally to understand, the challenges, but look for opportunities and believe with enough positive thinking, creativity, and kind of collaboration that will actually move the needle on some of those things, maybe not all of them. But you end up energized, and I think it becomes, as you mentioned, somewhat contagious.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree on that as well. I say oftentimes when I'm talking about the thesis of this show that I want our societies to have more entrepreneurial thinking, elected officials, politicians, professors, doctors, scientists, right? So I'm going to ask you, because you've been in the game so long and you have existed inside of many of these different silos over the course of your career. How do we find those leaders, or how do we create pathways for those types of leaders in society, right? How do we nurture that type of thinking in people beyond just the traditional entrepreneur or investor class?
Yeah, and I think you can have entrepreneurial thinking in all those categories. I think the range and scope probably needs to reflect the reality you're working in. Having spent first part of my career in corporate America, leading innovation functions. It needs to be grounded in kind of, resources and current business lines, and frankly, the politics of getting support. That's not the case, honestly, when you're, a solo startup founder and you have a great idea that can change the world. You certainly have to bring people along to join the team and raise the capital, but you're not constrained by, legacy businesses and competing against what you already have and kind of the innovator's dilemma. So the constraints are quite different. You have more degrees of freedom. I would say in the political world, it is hard to be a bold thinker. And I spent 8 years in elected office, though that was kind of a culmination of 20 years of doing, public services and commissions and steering committees and all those things involved in the political realm. And what I've come to conclude is that if you're really going to be long-term in politics, you have to become a politician. In a sense, it's kind of the game you're in or you're not in. And I think the bold entrepreneurs soon realize that getting votes and being elected is really the primary metric. And sometimes it also means, progressing your way through political opportunities and hierarchies. So it's about incentive systems, and there the incentive is, to get votes and not necessarily to be change agents. And so, 8 years, it took me 8 years. So I'm a slow learner to really figure that out. I love the idea of public service. I mean, I have a very idealized view of it. And I tried to bring entrepreneurial thinking, and bureaucracies are not always that receptive to change, number one. I would also say that, when you're in elected office, you are, your ability to create change is determined around how you can bring others along, because whatever your one vote is, whether it's in a council of 8 people or, a Senate of 100, you need to get the votes. And votes are, for those electeds, are very much driven by what they think their constituencies want and how they retain their seat or elevate their position, which is not really the metric around being a change agent.
Right.
In some ways, it's actually quite the opposite. Let's just as an example, reducing lanes of traffic to create bike lanes. Well, most people today are in their cars in Los Angeles. So you're going to piss off a lot of people who are like, I'm already taking, too long from, to get to my house to work. And are you, effing crazy that you're going to try to put a bike lane in Venice? And like, I would argue that what we call multimodal transportation, having biking, walking, mass transit is kind of really makes for a more livable city.
Yeah.
But when you have to make changes where people don't understand kind of the end game, the constituencies, the voters, then I think elected officials often don't have the political will, or, they kind of see that as in conflict with, retaining their seat. And so, that's a tension, and I get it. So I'm kind of empathetic to those constraints. I think it's, in some ways, it's better to be like an advocate and an educator. You have to educate the populace to see the opportunity to drive the change, to bring the electeds forward, so they see it as political benefit to them that's going to help them curry votes, rather than saying I'm going to be kind of some sort of bold leader and my constituency is going to look like a deer in the headlights, and I tell them we're going to down a lane of traffic. So once again, that's an extreme example. Like I choose. And it is always surprising how often at those public meetings, no one shows up until you talk about, putting in a stop sign or closing a lane of traffic. And sometimes you could be doing something much more monumental.
Well, and that's an interesting point, right? Because to that, I'm always curious, right? Because I would think that the opportunity in public service and political office, right, for entrepreneurial thinking would be a build, like kind of a grow mentality, right? Like a lean forward, like how can we? But as you say, oftentimes you don't trigger the reaction or the pull the people off the couch to voice their opinions about things unless you're taking something away from them or the person.
It's got to be very here and now.
Yeah.
I'll give you one other example. It kind of relates to my work in building ecosystems. I helped found Innovate Pasadena 15 years ago. which was really about bringing together what I call the east side of Los Angeles innovation community with more of a focus on B2B and kind of frontier tech versus, kind of what was happening at Silicon Beach. And I tried to get the city and my colleagues excited about that. I'm excited about it. And we can talk about why ecosystems matter, but I do think they matter tremendously. And it was a real yawner for them. And they're like, well, we have a nice economy and we have a lot of movie theaters and retail. And, why would you even want to do that? That seems like work. And so, they weren't against it, but they weren't leaning in.
Yeah.
Now, fast forward post-pandemic, office buildings are empty. They're worried about who's going to shop, on their retail environment and go to their restaurants. And now they're all behind what was the playbook I put together 12 years ago around building innovation-based companies that require, lab space and R&D space and, machine shops, things that are really hard to do remotely, which are traditionally filled up office spaces. So now there's, it's the number one priority on the economic development strategic plan, which I helped rewrite, by the way, on the task force recently.
They just didn't appreciate 12 years ago that you were offering a blueprint to future-proof the economy of the area, of the neighborhood, of the city, of the region.
Yeah,
right?
Only if I've been able to predict the pandemic. But anyway, it's just part of this is timing too. Is like now they had like people all over them about empty buildings and things like that. And they're like, oh, that's a solution to a high priority, urgent voter constituent driven issue, and not a strategic issue. So I think they tend to be more short sighted. It's kind of give them what they want, and sometimes community leadership in building cities. Some issues take building. Let's say go back to the transportation discussion. Building a connected bike infrastructure is like building the metro. It is a multi-decade. It's not tens of billions, but even in a city like Pasadena, it's tens of millions of dollars. And people will say, well, no one's riding their bike on the one bike trail we built. Well, it didn't go anywhere.
We built a bike trail to nowhere, right? Yeah.
That's how it starts. And you got to build, then you have two bike trails to nowhere. Then you suddenly have some bike trails that actually go somewhere. Then ultimately you have a bike network. So anyway, it's a different set of incentives. That's really what I'm emphasizing here when you try to be a change agent or innovator.
I'm curious, did the consensus building skills that you allude to, that you obviously had to develop, having come in from the private sector, in the public service, in the public sector, elected official, and you had to figure out ways to work inside those systems and build consensus. Did those consensus building skills? Two questions. Did those consensus building skills come naturally to you, just personally? And then the second question is, have you seen that the consensus building muscles that you developed while you were in service have become useful for you then in your other private sector work and building relationships?
100%. I think, flash way back to my, days in Harvard Business School where, coming up with a smart idea and, cleverly articulating it and skewering your classmate was incentivized. That doesn't get you very far in, an elected, when you're at a dais with other elected officials trying to get, votes to support your, what you think is a good idea. So I would tell you first with consensus building is listening, because what you'll find out, it's true in any kind of decision-making scenario, is that everyone who's sitting around a dais in a decision-making, situation or table, whatever you want to describe, they have some incentives of what they're trying to accomplish. And the good news is, I spent, 10 or 12 hours a week with these people. So I know after, a year or two, kind of what made them tick. Is when you wanted to get something done, you had to kind of craft the opportunity that kind of connected with what their priorities were. So you first had to understand who they were and build mental models about, who Rob Ryan is, what he cares about, and what Joe cares about. And so when you wanted to get legislation done, you got to kind of tick all those boxes, or enough of those boxes, so you could get, 50% of the vote or more to get something passed. And that often, in corporate America, larger corporations have a bit more consensus building to it. But, there are very few scenarios like in the world of elected politics and public service, where one person's a decider. In a corporate America, I mean, use like Elon Musk as an example. He's not looking for consensus for anybody.
No.
Uh, and it's kind of like, and he's considered obviously one of the greatest entrepreneurs of our time. So, if you're king, I guess you don't need to
Right.
build consensus. And, maybe if you were a public servant in Singapore, it might be a little easier to, be bold.
But last time I checked, having just read your bio, like you have never been a king here locally, so you've always had to build consensus.
That's right. That's right. And I think sometimes you're like, ooh, it's maybe in some ways you could think about places where I think our elected democracy is by far the best system in the world, but it's not always the one that's most rapid to accept change and embrace change.
Yeah. No, I used to say, I'm sure you've said this before. You'll get a kick out of it at the least. 20 some odd years ago when I did a ton of business in China and Far East Asia. And I used to say when in China then, and it was just me learning it in my 30s. Like I was like, oh, okay. So, the great advantage of China is the great weakness of China is that one guy can stand up and tell a billion people what to go build. Right. And so therefore they can build things faster, more at scale, like without a need for consensus. But of course, that is the ultimate downfall of that system as well.
100%. Yeah, right, that's the double-edged sword for sure.
Yeah. You mentioned it before. You talked about ecosystems, right? Entrepreneurial economies, we call them ecosystems. Whatever. There's a whole bunch of different descriptors for them. What do you think are the few critical elements for any? And let's talk in the context of where we are, right? So Southern California. We're talking about regional or neighborhood level localized entrepreneurial ecosystems, or someone who's listening who might be saying, we're trying to develop an entrepreneurial ecosystem in a mid-sized city in Latin America somewhere, right? Like, which is a lot of the work that I had the pleasure of doing for the prior decade. What are the few absolutely key elements that are crucial to building successful entrepreneurial economy?
100%. I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and early on, I've done a lot of collaboration and with one of our advisors and supporters, Brad Feld. You're probably familiar with his book.
Sure. Yep.
Startup Communities, and I love Brad and his thinking. And I think first of all, they're ecosystems, so there are a lot of moving pieces that work together. I do think the entrepreneur innovator is at the center of that. They're the change agent, and that could be could be just in public service, or when we think of startups, it's, you need entrepreneurs who are trying to build something. So having people who kind of see a vision of the future, enough of those, you could have entrepreneurship anywhere, right? But you may not have an entrepreneurial ecosystem. So you need to have critical mass of people who are those change agents looking to, create something new that solves problems, that is repeatable and sustainable and can achieve scale. Like those are what startups looks like, scalable startups. And how do you do that? On my last calculation, I personally either founded or co-founded 9 companies. The last 3 have been impact organizations, and there's, once again, just like we talked about entrepreneurship, there's some very similar characteristics to building an impact startup as it is for a for-profit, and some things that are different. But I think having enough people who want to do that, so there's a kind of a tribe. I've been spending a fair amount of time in El Segundo, or the Gundo, as it's known as. There's kind of a tribe down there that's focused on aerospace and defense and deep technology. So having a critical mass of people, and I think they can be in the same place, but if they're not connected, they're kind of just locked into their own space. There's kind of a community aspect of that's really important. So having the innovators, having some desire and sense to be part of a community. I do think obviously there's, capital is important to help them grow. I guess I always think of entrepreneurship as kind of a team sport. You need like the team, the team captain who's going to run the sport, but they need all the players on the field. So you need the entrepreneur, but then you need the capital provider, you need the mentors, you need the partners, you need the employees, you need people who, as you're growing your business, are also risk takers to maybe a slightly less extent than the entrepreneur themselves. But if you have people who are like to have regular jobs and don't want to jump off the deep end, it's hard to build a community of startups. I spent 6 months up in Seattle working at Microsoft Ventures, and I'll tell you, there is a lot of innovation there, but there's not a lot of entrepreneurship. There's see surprisingly few number of startups for a place that has, some of the greatest, technology, companies,
Interesting.
Microsoft, Boeing, God help them.
Yeah.
They're just not a lot of people who are willing to leave their day jobs to go out and take the jump. So
Yeah.
I think there's kind of a cultural aspect that allows a community to, encourage entrepreneurship. And
Do
there are all
do
those
do
building blocks.
universities, and then also does government? I mean, you alluded to how government, like you with your original pitch back in Pasadena,
Yeah.
and now they're leaning into it. So, are universities a key component to or like a healthy ecosystem?
Yeah, I think they can certainly contribute to it, but they're not a requirement,
Okay.
right? So let me give you an example. Here I am in Pasadena. We got Caltech, literally a mile from my house. Some of the greatest scientific minds in the world, but they're really not that interested in creating startups.
Okay.
So I have a great university. They much, as I say, not all of them, but the vast majority of them. If you gave them a choice, Rob, to make $1 billion, running a startup company or winning a Nobel Prize, 100% are going to say, "Give me the Nobel Prize."
Nobel Prize.
Yeah, but you go to Stanford or MIT, where kind of engineering, building companies is much more part of their DNA. It's kind of a more applied engineering. They're really foundational to what's happened, in Silicon Valley and in Cambridge and Kendall Square. Like those are foundational. So, universities can contribute in a meaningful way. I don't think they're a prerequisite.
Yeah, that's
They can
fascinating.
be helpful. They can be helpful and more helpful than in some scenarios than others. Um, I do find that when you have a good undergraduate school that's producing talent who has a risk taking appetite, then those students can be kind of fodder, so to speak, who can go join startups because they don't have families and mortgages, and so it's important to have kind of a skill base and a workforce that can go support the entrepreneur. I don't think universities are mission critical to that. Once again, I think it can vary. I think what ASU does and is very important. They've leaned into that as part of
Yeah.
their strategy. SDSU is literally leaning into that. San Diego State and the Mission Valley, they see that part of their work as being kind of economic development oriented. But a lot of universities, don't necessarily prioritize that work. It also separate, my eldest son went to Babson College. It's very well known for entrepreneurship. It's part of their core curriculum. Every freshman has to launch a company. By the way, he retired. He's now back at my house enjoying free rent, starting a company.
That's very innovative, very entrepreneurial thinking of him.
I couldn't tell him it was a bad idea as a 9-time entrepreneur. Like, what the
Right. Exactly. You just didn't know you were going to sign up to be his landlord again, but that's okay.
and one of his seed investors or whatever his angel
Right.
investors.
Right. Exactly.
But some schools like prioritize entrepreneurship is my point.
Sure.
And I think the more they do that, the more they can help feed the ecosystem.
Yeah.
But, also, here we are in Southern California, USC and UCLA have entrepreneurship programs. I think in most cases, they're more giving students a sense of what that experience looks like and what the thinking is.
Yeah.
Their job really is not, and frankly, it shouldn't be to force people to create startup companies.
Right.
I mean, it's like you should give it a whirl, see how it feels. And some people say, this feels great. But even for those who it doesn't feel great, it's kind of nice to have kind of swung the bat a little bit and say either I like it or I don't like it, or here's at least the entrepreneur's mindset.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I've also often thought, right, like you and I could probably go on the road and do this at those universities, right? Like give a class or a course or a talk on entrepreneurial thinking, right?
Yeah.
And because that's I think, not to diminish the good work of all the great people that build these units inside of these universities, but I think to your point, the main value for that community is that it's an opportunity to exercise those entrepreneurial muscles in a relatively kind of safe environment where there is support of the community, and it also it's another connection point to the alumni community, et cetera. But no, I like that. I like that idea that both universities and governments are, if interested, if activated, can be net positives, but not requirements, right? Like,
I do think government, same thing. I think you captured it well. They can be resistors, like, think about it, also going to a super business friendly.
Right.
And
And
they
and
allow,
if it works,
yeah,
now it's just a level of friction that man, maybe we go next door, right?
yeah. And I think, I use that as an example because, what they're doing requires a lot of tooling and machining and all those things, and probably has issues around zoning. If you're building software, AI software in a corporate center, it's really hard. Like they don't really need a lot of support from the government to allow those uses to happen.
Right.
So kind of the more extreme the use, the more government support you need. So you're doing aerospace and defense and building microfusion reactors. You probably need to have the government agency that you're next to kind of, or who's with you, supporting you, giving you the zoning and the permits to do that. I think the other thing is kind of this concept of density. Like you got to have critical mass. And I remember when we started, I started working at Innovate Pasadena. Like it's a concept, didn't have a name. I started, Friday coffee meetup with 4 CEOs at the local Jones coffee shop, and 5 years later, we had 6,000 people, and it was the largest tech meetup in Southern California. We didn't have 6,000 people, but we moved like 9 different venues. We're at the convention center. Reminds me a little bit, I don't know if you remember when Jason Nazar did his events in Santa Monica. He started like literally, I was one of his first speakers when he was running DocStock, in Santa Monica. And then he went to the library and a bigger venue. So you have the people interested to create that community and, as I say, get the players on the field.
Okay, you've talked now a few times about Innovate Pasadena. I feel like it was the precursor for the work that you've wound up doing most recently with the Alliance for SoCal Innovation. So, talk to us. This is, and then I'm gonna give you a chance to talk about what's going on in today's news. But first, before we do that, let's just talk about what is the Alliance for SoCal Innovation. This is kind of the commercial. What is it? Why does it exist? And then how does it function in kind of a regional leadership capacity to catalyze other communities?
Yeah. And, a little bit of the work at Innovate Pasadena is kind of that thesis that innovation is kind of a team or community sport. And I think, in Southern California, which is a place that's so dear to my heart. I mean, I love living here. I feel blessed every day. But I also love innovation and entrepreneurship. And I talked to people. I was literally talking to somebody yesterday about, they're kind of in their phase of life as you and I are, where they're thinking not just about where the next paycheck is going to come from, but what type of legacy might we leave. And I always tell people when you do that, think about where your superpower has been accumulated from your kind of your professional experience, and then align that with where you want to have impact. So, like I've started companies. I know entrepreneurship, and like, so how do I, in my view, bring that sense of what that journey looks like in help entrepreneurs, because I think they play such an important role in solving some of the world's most important problems, but also creating high quality jobs in a place that's expensive to live.
Yeah.
So like, who wouldn't want to get up and help people who help create high quality jobs, solve important problems where people can stay in Southern California? And as much as we keep trying to raise the minimum wage and, force people to have, affordable housing, what really matters, and those are important efforts, but they're kind of trivial given the size of the economy, is we need to create high quality jobs, and innovation jobs are the highest quality jobs probably in the world.
Yep.
And every innovation job creates 4 or 5 other jobs in an economy. So I care about having vibrancy in Southern California, and I worry about, people leaving the state because it's expensive. So what can we do to kind of make sure that that rich diversity of people who we want to maintain here in Southern California can afford to live here? So let's create more entrepreneurial tech jobs. That's kind of my mission. And Innovate Pasadena, I was, when I started Innovate Pasadena, it was a little bit selfish because I was running a CRM company that used machine learning, and I kept going over to Silicon Beach, and they were talking about the next, dating app or some content creation. It was like a whole different world.
Yeah.
So part of this is when you're creating tribes and communities, is figuring out kind of what is the commonality around the journey that people are going on. And I do a lot of work with Techstars and other accelerators, and I believe kind of the ones that are a little bit more thesis driven allow more connectivity and shared learning. So Innovate Passion is really around kind of getting that community together, and also saving me the 2-hour drive each way.
You Idea Lab guys were you've been doing that for a long time, right? I mean, and you were all building kind of these what you and I would have called like meaningful B2B enterprise type companies, right?
So long story short, I needed that community to myself. Innovate Passion is really self-serving in some ways. Is like, oh, I know there are other people who are part of a community. I need to, learn from them, and maybe they can learn from me, and we can share resources and know-how and staff. And so that was kind of the genesis. Once again, it had an economic development aspect to it.
But those years of experience, for those reasons and beyond, then put a pretty good set of skills in your back pocket as the Alliance for SoCal Innovation was being created.
100%. So the Alliance was actually conceptualized, as you may know, by Steve Poizner and a bunch of Silicon Valley luminaries who were focused on the economic development agenda for the state. And they felt, too much of this high quality innovation economy was captive to the Bay Area and not enough was happening here. So the idea of Alliance was really like a proactive way to kind of stir the pot down here. So they interviewed me because at BCG, who we're very grateful for the pro bono work they do, was writing the business plan. And, if you ever hired a consultant, first thing they do is interview 100 people, and then they present the ideas as their own. And I was, number 3 on their list of people to talk to about building innovation communities and kind of supporting the entrepreneurial activity in Southern California. So I was initially an advisor, and then when they put some seed money in the not-for-profit, I became the first CEO. And, what's interesting, it was a startup, it was literally a napkin. Steve's like, we're going to do more. I have no idea how we're going to do it. We have no business model. We have no programming. And, for most people who are saying that would be probably a no-go. For me, it was just startup number 9.
All right, exactly.
I'm like, hey, yeah, I think, I love doing this. I have, as you mentioned, some experience at a much smaller scale in Pasadena the Alliance for Southern California Innovation is, Santa Barbara to San Diego to Riverside. It's huge, and I would argue maybe a little too big.
I was going to say that's like it might be 2 countries, right?
Yeah, it's 20 million people and the 11th largest economy in the world. And I'll just say, kind of at its core, what we decided a year into it, and I should say we were kind of initially seated with all the kind of vice chancellors of all the UC systems because Janet Napolitano was involved. And so we had a lot of academic people, and it's a little bit why we know a lot about how innovation works in academia. And I'd say we have built some great expertise on lab to market, which is, principal investigators taking science and bringing it into the commercial world, which is quite different than, the MBA student or the entrepreneurship undergrad.
Very, very different, very unique, but also hugely important.
Yeah. So once again, we're thinking about impact. Like if you have a new therapeutic or a new nanotechnology that can go in a battery that's invented at Caltech, what would be more important than getting that kind of product into the commercial world to solve, climate change? So we spent a lot of work in there, but we figured just working on, lab to market wasn't enough. And so we spent time in corporate innovation. And then I think the program I'm most proud of is our capital access program, our SoCal Venture Pipeline.
Yeah.
And what we found is that, there are so many, you can imagine, great entrepreneurs in a geography of 20 million people. But entrepreneurship is pretty evenly distributed across the region. The access and the opportunity to kind of create impact is not. And, in particular, I'm talking about getting institutional capital. So if you're worked at Google as a product manager in, Playa and, went to Stanford, you probably knew all the VCs. And if you wanted to pitch somebody, it's pretty easy. But if you're working on an ag tech company out of Riverside, God help you, even if you have something that could feed the world, the idea of accessing, institutional capital is about zero.
Yeah.
So we conceptualize this program to find the top entrepreneurs across the region and essentially, give them, their time on stage. I like the America's Got Talent. Like you could be the best singer in the world, but you're in a gospel church in Arkansas.
If no one,
on Spotify. So we're looking for those people. And we've talked to thousands of entrepreneurs, and we've selected about 100. So super selective program. And what we do is we basically wrap them into the VC community. We have 250 venture funds. We've agreed to look at the best of the best. And of the almost 100 that have been accepted, about a third of them have raised capital. A typical check size is $4 million. So we're raising well over $100 million. Maybe it's 120 million at this point for entrepreneurs across Southern California. And I'm pleased to say, even though we don't kind of juice the scores for diverse candidates, 40% of the companies have female founders and 60% are people of color. And shouldn't be surprising because that's kind of reflective of who's starting the companies.
Right.
So, the good news and bad news. The bad news is VCs typically don't effectively and consistently fund diverse founders.
Yep.
The good news is if you present them the best founders, regardless of what they look like, they'll fund them.
Right.
And it's really about where they're going and what networks they tap into. So we go out of our way to actually have a very big tent strategy. And then when we bring those to the VCs, they don't care. If you have a great company, they don't care what you look like.
100%.
Leaders they're never going to open your email because they don't know who you are. But when the alliance reps a great entrepreneur, they know who the alliance is. And they know that we've kind of hyper scrubbed, who's good. And they've got to be venture ready. And there are other programs that try to provide access to first-time entrepreneurs, but they're not as kind of rigorous in terms of selection.
Sure.
And what happens is the investors stop looking at them because how hard it is and what they want. Like they want venture-ready companies.
Yep.
And so our commitment to them is we're going to find you the best venture-ready entrepreneurs across the state. And that program's worked really well. And we recently stood up a co-investment fund. So whenever an entrepreneur gets a check from a lead investor, we cover 10% of the round out of our SoCal Catalyst Fund.
Oh, wow.
With the goal of creating an index fund of the next next great generation of entrepreneurs coming from the region.
Right. So why not? Right. I mean, why not take a piece of that? Essentially, reap the benefit of the seeds that you helped sow and water and nurture over the decades. And quick plug for the Entrepreneurial Thinkers community here at our show. This program is run by another smart former alumnus of the show, Eric Aid.
Yeah, 100%. And what's cool about the fund too is our limited partners obviously we think are going to get great returns because they're backing the best entrepreneurs who are funded by institutional capital. But both the management fees and the carried interest go back to supporting the program itself. So it's kind of a sustainability program. I like to call it impact capitalism. Like it's capitalism, but it has impact embedded in it.
Yeah.
So, that's been a lot of fun. Or last thing we do is work with other NGOs and not-for-profits and helping coordinate what's going on with respect to supporting innovation and entrepreneurship across the region. There are many organizations, but they all work kind of in a silo, like it's hyper geographically focused, or it's aerospace only, or it's med device. So how do we create kind of the connective tissue? Our mantra is that we're the region's strategic super connector. Like we're trying to knit the fabric. What I think is particularly unique in Southern California is that we're super big, but we're so spread out, so that kind of getting the players on the field is really hard because you don't know, you can't even see them.
Right. So, literally, I was going to ask that. So it's been one of the things I've always fundamentally been curious about. Right. We are so geographically diverse, right? So spread out. It's physically a large region as well as economically a powerhouse region. Like when you guys launched this, so we go back 7-8 years ago, right? Like were these disparate interests essentially seeing one another as competitors, right? Just like traditional economic development competitors, right? We want stuff to happen in the Inland Empire versus Orange County, or we want it to happen in San Diego versus LA, et cetera. And now have you guys been able to kind of at least mesh together some cohesiveness amongst all these disparate, almost, again, co-opetition, right? Like we used to say back in the late 90s.
And I think that's 100% correct, is when you really don't think about kind of regional advantage, you just think you're competing with everybody, then you're like, well, I don't really want to work with those people. And what you realize, and we just held our regional leadership conference a few weeks ago, and we had 50 leaders from across the region who historically thought of themselves as competitors.
Yeah, right. That's an incredible event. You invited me to a couple years back, and I sat in that room with all those people, and you're like, we have so much more in common than we do not, right?
It's a collective community of practice, and what I think they've come to realize, and we're really happy about this, is it's kind of that Rubik's cube. They all fit together once you know where you're, like what color and where you are. So if I'm in El Segundo, just go back, it's like I'm doing aerospace and defense. If you're in Pasadena, there's probably a lot of biochemistry and robotics going on here. If you're in Santa Monica and Silicon Beach, there's probably consumer content, media, gaming. Like it kind of depends. And if you're in Santa Barbara, there's LED lighting, and there's kind of a lot of kind of complementary competencies that are not that, they're kind of unique. And our view is once you understand that richness, like you really want the region to thrive and kind of understand how to kind of energize your own unique community. And the real power, though, is connecting those communities into a energized network, right? And that's what we do. Is like, hey, you want to celebrate the greatness of your community, wherever that is. Could be, Orange County and med devices and cyber. We want to know who you are and what you do well and support you, but also make sure when we're doing grant response that if we need a cyber component and it's in healthcare, that we put some of these sub communities together so we actually speak as one region and kind of can complement ourselves and kind of hit with all the force and the potential of this massive region, rather than you just kind of chipping away because you're working in isolation. So this kind of collaborative coordination and partnership. And I think people have really come, I would say this probably Art's biggest accomplishment is helping people appreciate the richness and the diversity and the complementary nature of what we do. Certainly we all want jobs and, capital, but, it's not like, VCs, if I'm writing a check to a med tech company in Orange County, I'm probably not the same guy who would be writing a check to a gaming company in Santa Monica. Like that check, I'm not losing that check.
Right. No. And as you and I both know, and it, like over time, especially nowadays, more so, post pandemic, particularly, so much of that smart capital is just, they've got one guy or one gal in San Diego, and then they've got another person who works remotely in LA, and then they've got maybe their main office is in Silicon Valley, or maybe it's not, maybe it's in LA, and then they've got a remote. So it's like spread itself to kind of get access to these local economies much more aggressively than it used to, at least in my opinion. All right, so we talked about the challenges you guys helped overcome with with the geographic diversity, right, and the space. Talk to me about something that I know you've written about. You literally have it in your peppered across your LinkedIn in a couple different places. The idea that you and I both fundamentally believe this, but I want you to talk about it, why it's so important. The demographic diversity, like our ethnic, our demographic diversity here is, we both believe, our super strength. That's our superpower as a region. Talk about that and talk about why it's so important.
Well, I'll give you a good example and maybe tie into kind of what I'm going to be doing next based off our announcement. Two dimensions that are really important to diversity, and I really want to use it like every flavor of the word, but I just mentioned the diversity of kind of sub-industry cluster, like whether it's, where these specialties are taking place. That's really important. We talked a little bit about diversity of kind of the university system. Caltech's a research university. You got, UCLA, and you got, which is an R1 university that, has lots of undergrads, and you get a place like, Claremont that's purely undergrad. So I think you get talent pool of different people. I also think, clearly our, ethnic diversity is incredibly important. I think having different lived experiences allows people to think about problems in diverse ways. And I think fundamentally, the worst way to solve a problem is get, 10 people who think about the problem the same way, and they're going to get more or less, 10 of the same answers. So I think having people who can see problems from different vantage points is foundational to coming up with creative solutions to those problems.
Yeah, 100%.
So I think that is kind of the core, like, it's funny, I'm pretty good friends with Frances Arnold, who won the Nobel Prize from Caltech a few years ago. She happens to co-chair PCAST, which is the President's Council on Advanced Technology and Innovation. And she won her Nobel Prize for chemistry, where she used evolution to solve chemistry problems. So it was like natural selection. And so it was diversity of like things trying. And then she kind of basically accelerated that experiment, almost evolution, to solve certain chemistry experiments.
Wow.
So it was natural biology stimulated to come up with an outcome. And I feel like, diverse ecosystems have that diverse biology and they look at problems in a different way.
And so with
Yeah.
with someone like yourself, right? So because even just in that answer right there, yeah, I can feel it bleeding through, right? You're again, like you and I, we're very similar in a lot of ways. We're different people, but very similar. And you're fed by a natural curiosity, right? And that natural curiosity has kind of like jumped you through different stages of your career, through different areas that you've worked in, and your work has been dynamic with the Alliance for SoCal Innovation. You have taken from nothing, right, and created this organization, this community that has connected the region into what it is. But that curiosity bug got you now, and so now you're on to something else, which is the breaking news we've alluded to twice. You shared a beautiful announcement this morning under the banner of the Alliance in a lovely email that articulated not just the change of direction for you, but obviously of kind of the trajectory of the organization, which I thought was an awesome testament to obviously your work, but the whole team's work and just the board and the community, the region as a whole, right? That it's realized what you and its founding group thought was possible, which was, can we get ourselves to set aside some of our petty geographic cultural differences and realize that if we play together, we can all help each other win, raise all boats, right? But hey, you and I are also curious beings. I've reinvented myself in this last year and decided to become this guy using these skills acquired and honed over my 35-year career. And you're taking your 35-year career and you're going to do something different. So tell us about what your big shift is.
Yeah, absolutely. And, as I say, as soon as I get comfortable with something, it's time to like do something different.
Right.
Very much a 0 to 1 person. Like, my wife's a lawyer and has practiced the same type of law and become the most expert probably in the state. And so she's at the 99.9% level. And, that incrementalism would drive me crazy. So I like the steep part of the learning curve. So as soon as it flattens out, I got to throw myself in a new adventure. And part of the work, and I'll tie it back to the Alliance, has been working in the healthcare space. And the reason I'm particularly interested in healthcare, two dimensions of that. One is if you think about the potential for innovation to be transformative, that's the largest part of our economy. It impacts all of our qualities of life. So I'm thinking like as innovation kind of, Swiss Army knife, if I was going to maybe dig in a little bit further, healthcare would be a place that could be interesting. And we've done a bunch of things around AI and healthcare, and we happen to have in Southern California, because of our scale, the largest number of large health systems in one geography. So it lends itself to kind of being like a crucible, not just of systems, but we're talking about the diversity of who lives here. And if you're going to have a laboratory, you can't have a bunch of, clones of people who look all the same, because you're never quite sure whether clinical treatment might.
Right. Only developing solutions for diseases that, middle-aged white guys, from the Midwest have. That's not going to solve the world's problems.
So I think of Southern California for those two reasons being a really tremendously attractive place to be a leader in healthcare innovation. And we've kind of toyed around in that area. So my next journey, and it will happen after a little hiatus over Christmas and adventuring in New Zealand with the kids, is I'll be working at USC Keck, working on kind of strategic partnerships in healthcare innovation.
Very exciting. They're lucky to have you.
Well, I kind of feel like I haven't been in an academic clinical research environment, so it's a glaring gap on my resume because I've pretty much covered everything else. And it's good because, CAC obviously has the med school and research, so I'll have researchers there, and they have a fairly large hospital system. And Steve Shapiro, who runs those two worlds, who'll be my boss, came from UPMC, which is considered, Pittsburgh is like considered one of the premier health systems in Israel. he has a team there that's operating med systems and you know med schools and pharmacy schools, and there isn't somebody who's thinking about like what is the long game around partnerships, strategy, and innovation, because the operational demands of those kind of frontline activities are very intense. So my kind of function now will be kind of the long range visionary in terms of looking at what are the bigger moves, whether that be partnerships, adopting certain technologies, investing in venture funds, maybe standing up certain types of institutes to kind of create step change in healthcare.
It's exciting, really exciting.
Who knows what the impact will be, but you'll know it will be zero unless you try.
Oh, 100%.
So,
I mean, I'll say it for you because you're a humble guy, but everything that we've discussed to this point indicates that there is a higher likelihood that you'll have a great impact than there is not, right?
Because you can never be arrogant about these things. Like
but you're bringing together. You're entering a new arena which you're humbly excited about, which is the most important thing, right? You're eagerly curious to learn and to surround yourselves, as I know you've done throughout your career, with other smart people who are expert at the things you're not expert in. But you also bring like all of this unique energy and expertise and just a deep kind of sensibility about relationship building and the human nuance of that, while also measuring kind of the scientific complexity of that, right? And you literally understand how to weave together networks, and to do that. And again, hey, we're young guys. We're just getting started, you and I. But to do that at our chapter in life, right, which is maybe we'll just call it the last third or so, right? Like to do that in the space of healthcare, life sciences, health, all those medicines, all those things related. I mean, that literally is obviously a unique opportunity to leave an incredible legacy of impact that will far outlive you and I. That will outlive your kids, right? And it will be the things that my 37-day-old grandson will benefit from here, living in Southern California beyond. So that's congratulations, first of all.
Gets us up in the morning, and I think that's it. When I'm not as excited to get out of bed, I got to change the dynamic and figure out the next challenge. And it is the learning process too. Is like you really want to bring the cumulative knowledge of people who are in kind of our stage of life, but towards new problem sets.
Yeah,
and that allows you two things. One is to use the expertise, but also to expand the expertise at the same time.
100% true.
So I'm looking forward to that. And as I mentioned, healthcare is a huge industry. It's a huge industry in Southern California, but I also think some of the fundamentals around the health system here, say the scale, the number of system players, really positions us. It's kind of like the studios, you got to put up a mass, and I'm thinking like, wouldn't that be a great thing, to put that to advantage in a very strategic way, not just to CAC, but also engage other health systems, because I think my sense is it's going to be a bit like you just described when I got to the Alliance, is that these communities saw themselves competing.
Mm-hmm.
And, health systems do compete, let's be clear. But the problem and the opportunity in healthcare is so expansive.
Yep.
Let's focus on the areas of like the unserved, the white spaces, because that is like 10 times bigger than the competitive areas. And if we can kind of collectively find our own pathway and move innovation in this geography by working together as a community, and also where do we experiment and how do we figure out who's experimenting in what areas, I think we can be global leaders around healthcare innovation if that collaboration piece can take place. Because we have the R1 universities, we have the researchers. There's no reason, like the fundamentals are there.
Yeah.
So there is a little bit of a community building alignment piece that I'm particularly good at. And, USC is, I think, a great platform to provide that leadership. So, nothing ventured, nothing gained. We're going to go in and see how we can do this. But, I said that leverages the last 7.5 years I've been at the Alliance. Like I could never be doing this 8 years earlier.
Nope.
So I kind of look at our careers as kind of layer cakes.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. I mean, all jokes aside, I like to be self-deprecating, as you do occasionally, right? But the truth is, there have been very important people in my life that I have a ton of respect for who've been telling me I was a professional storyteller for 20 years, right? And that I was just using it in different applications and in different niches and different places that I was working professionally as kind of like an adjunct piece of my life. And I just decided to finally to say, okay, wait a minute, maybe I should just heed what they've been saying and try and become that, right? And use that set of skills honed or gifts given or whatever it might be. Because you got to have that, as I say in the little promo clip for this show, I woke up midsummer last year and just thought like, okay, I'm kind of bored. I'm tired. I know how to do what I've been doing in my sleep, and I want to challenge myself to see if I can be good at something different. So all respect to you, my friend. I have, and quick note, obviously, tip of the cap to the Alliance team. The Alliance is in great hands. The Alliance has incredible staff and leadership there currently that will be handling the transition, that'll be involved in the go forward. And I likened it, as I read your note right before we went on air, I likened it to, like a beloved sports franchise, right? Like I'm a Liverpool soccer football fan here in the U.S. And our manager of the last 9 years, Jurgen Klopp, famously left last offseason and reinvigorated the organization and like sometimes organizations just the organizations need the change in human
100%.
leadership, right? A different voice in the locker room, so to speak.
One of the things I did recently was I was tapped to do charter reform for the city of Pasadena, and I helped get through term limits. And it's, I just feel like after a certain amount of time, like you lose the spring in your step and the fresh ideas. And I would say I wasn't quite there at the Alliance, but I like having like my eyes wide open. It's like a kid, opening a Christmas box.
Super stimulated. Yes. Super. Woo! Exactly. Yeah. Like I got to pay attention. I might miss something today. Yeah.
So it's a little overwhelming, but it gets you energized, and I love the energy.
I love it. All right. So I've got one last question before we get to our closing segment. I try and do this because we've all experienced it, right? So much of today's business content, media landscape, right, is just all the stories are just up and to the right. Like it's as if none of us had experienced any failure or any adversity, and it's just all been nonstop success story. And gee, I want to be like that, right? And we all know that's not true, and that's nonsense. So if you can think of across the vastness of your career, and this could be a startup story, it could be a political story, whatever it is that comes to mind, right? If you share with us maybe a story about like a project or an idea or business that didn't go as planned, right? But that you took away some foundational lessons that have really endured in what you did with your career and what you built after that. Is there a story or stories like that?
So this one, I don't know if it's exactly what you're looking for, but it's kind of deeply sketched in my mind.
Please.
When I was a while ago, but my kids were involved in a kind of lab school. It was part of a college. So they were nursery school, and how sometimes they're like, and the college is focused on early childhood development and learning. And I ended up being asked to be on the board of the college, really in a perfunctory fundraising way, because you can imagine my personality is helpful in helping people raise funds, and my kids were there, so it was kind of a favor to the board chair. And it's like, you know how these things go, Rob. Like, just join the board. We meet, 4 times a year, no problem. Just show up. And I was gone on a business trip, and I came back, and I had been voted to be the board treasurer. And I'm like, what?
You're like, I feel like this is more than 4 times a year all of a sudden.
So I'm getting pulled in. And by the way, I'm not, as I mentioned, like I love healthcare and I know a little bit about this, but I know less about education, but it was a favor to some friends. Long story short, the school, which is very involved in educating people who run early childhood development communities and schools across the state, ended up going sideways. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't operating. I was on the board. And I knew enough and paid enough attention to their work to realize that this is going to be a train wreck, number one. And like of the 25 board members, 20 of them resigned on the spot.
Oof.
And I didn't have the common sense to resign. And so 5 of us, and I took 6 months off of my job.
Oh, wow.
To save the school. And, it was very difficult. Like the enrollment plummeted from 1,500 to 500. It was very tuition driven. Was involved in having to exit the president, whose husband was the largest GP in my fund. It was a difficult personal situation, but we were able to find an affiliation for the school and on a platform, and did that deal maybe like I think 12 years ago, and became friends with the person who now has the platform, a not-for-profit platform, and supports 10 small-scale, professionally oriented schools. And this school had like 2/3 of the students were kind of getting master's degrees and credentialing themselves to run preschools and early childhood centers. It was a very difficult time because the school was at risk of losing its accreditation. And once again, I know nothing about education,
and yet you felt compelled to be one of the 5 guys who didn't resign.
Yeah, and fast forward to today, the school has more students than it ever had.
Okay,
and I think the idea of an institution, and you can't read much about the state of California to hear about their commitment to early childhood and pre-K and all this stuff. And this is a school that credentials and trains. Well, it's the largest producer of those, master's degrees.
Okay,
and it was just on my watch of like, how would we kind of serve the next generation without the institution existing? And
because you could have just as easily resigned and just been like, wow, okay, this was a mistake. I shouldn't have signed up for that board commitment that day.
I think most people are like, oh, I'm out. And
apparently, yes, most people were like that. 20 of the 25 were like that.
And I think the message there, and unfortunately, it worked out. And I was just communicating. I was then on the selection committee to hire the new president. Now that they're on another president, I've always gone out of my way to help orient the new presidents of that school, because part of our DNA is on these things that become, reflections of us. And I think part of this is, when you start a company, it is a manifestation of, who you are. I also think, sometimes, and you choose to start a company, like I decided to start a company, but sometimes you find yourself in similar circumstances where your kind of your value system is challenged, and because of how you behave, you kind of, your DNA gets kind of captured in those unique circumstances.
Yeah.
Obviously I'm happy it worked out. I'm still like, how did that happen? But I do think, not to get philosophical, but, we all end up building skills and technical know-how, but also hopefully develop a value system.
Yeah.
That when, things become difficult, whether that be saving the school or saving your company or doing what you need to get your startup to survive, that we always keep our value system in mind.
Huge.
Because companies will come and go, but, it's like when I wake up to have an impact, I think I also like to wake up and feel like even in difficult times, I wasn't the 20 people who exited the boardroom.
Right.
And we were faced with the demise of an important institution.
Yeah, no, ultimately, right. Ultimately, our legacies are our relationships in that sense.
I also think the decisions we make that we know about ourselves, the ones we do make, to the positive and negative, we live with those kind of foundational ones for our lives, and they kind of define who we are.
Yep.
And anyway,
no, 100% agree. Thank you. That's an awesome story. I mean, I'm glad it worked out, but wow. And I'm also not surprised you weren't one of the 20 that bailed. But that's incredible. All right. So last question. I'd love to make this one kind of actionable.
Sure.
So a little bit more of a
bullet. I'll try not to depress people, but I wanted to give you one that had a happy ending, but it was.
It's all right. It's all good. It's all good.
A bit of a dark time.
No, it's okay. It's okay. It's a great story. All right. So I refer to us guys like you and I as relationship capitalists, right? So in that spirit, we're going to give some advice to people that are listening. Give us 2 or 3 strategies or tactics, however you'd like to slice this one, that you would recommend for someone of any stage of their career, of their leadership journey, of their life, right? That you're going to recommend to someone to try and grow their professional network, right? What are 2 or 3 key things you got to do if you want to grow your professional network over the long game?
So I have to interject. I mentioned that when I started Innovate Pasadena, I was working on a CRM company that had machine
Yeah.
learning, and it was the whole thesis. It was relationship capital management, RCM. So
There we go. I love it.
um,
I'm paying homage to you 20 years later.
I like that. A few things I would say. I get a lot of people who think they just networking is important, and I think that's true. But it's kind of like saying eating is important. Like, what are you eating and why are you eating it? So um, I always tell people, like, network with intent, in the sense that, like, oh, I go to all these things and I'm not really getting what I want. I'm like, well, ask yourself, what is your end game? And I'm not suggesting that, everything should be a transaction. It absolutely shouldn't be. But, are you ultimately thinking about your network for a job, or are you ultimately thinking about your network to find startups you can invest in? Are you ultimately thinking about your network for organizations to have community impact? So, you can socialize, go for sure socialize, but when you're networking, there tends to be kind of a utility aspect to it. So utility, so I always ask, what's the why? Like, what are you doing? And I spend a lot of time helping people. It's probably too much. And I think what I tell people is you first have to know what you're looking for before you ask for any assistance. So I get people saying, "Oh, I need a job. Like, can you help me get a job?" I'm like, and they show up and they're like, haven't really thought about what their interests are,
Right.
haven't really done anything to kind of educate themselves. So I'm like, kind of prepare yourself so that people who can help you can kind of help you in a meaningful way. So it's a little bit about kind of thinking before you act. Like, I guess that would be kind of my takeaways. Like,
Yeah.
have a strategy and have a goal. And I think, that you'll get there a lot faster when you kind of know where you want to go.
No, I love that. Have some intentionality about like you said, the proverbial, like, oh, I go to all these things, I go to all these events, but like, why did you go to that event? Like, why are you going to that event? And if it's social, that's okay. Then know that going in, right? If it's I'm going to build a relationship because I'm looking for help with this, or I'm looking for, yeah, that lack of intentionality is a killer.
And I would argue that there's some people who are like, hey, Rob, it's nice to meet you. Can you fund my company? Like,
Yeah.
not the other, like,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
too much intentionality. Like, another person, see if they have any interest, make sure, that they
Yes.
have some interest in you, you have some credibility before you
Yes,
ask
yes.
anything.
Build some relationships, but that's great wisdom. I love that. Hey, first things first. Thank you. This is great. I feel like we just turned like our lunch from last year into a podcast this year, which is great. I'm letting you off the hook on the lunch this year because you're going to New Zealand, which sounds like way more fun than hanging out with me and Liz Felice. But I will be excited to come downtown or wherever your tech office is going to be in the new year when you get back and visit with you down there, so you can start to tell me about how wide-eyed you are about all the things you're learning.
Be careful. I probably say be careful what you ask for. It's kind of when I got into politics, like, what?
No, it's going to be really exciting, and I say this oftentimes lately as I find myself interviewing folks that, unlike you and I, maybe a bit more generic or generalist. Like, I interview some of these folks that are so specifically working on one particular thing, and I say, like, I'm grateful when I wake up in the morning and I think that there are people out there that are obsessed about something that I am not obsessed about every day, right? Because I know then there's a greater chance that we're going to solve some of those things, and that's what I now feel about the world that you're stepping into. Like, I'm excited that team, which I want to succeed, I want the world to have better access to better healthcare, better solutions, better medical devices, all that type of stuff. I'm excited to know that big team now has you on it, because inevitably it'll be good, and inevitably it'll be good for Keck and USC and LA and the region, which is really exciting. So congratulations on that. Thank you for visiting with me today. It's been a pleasure. We'll put in the show notes the website for the Alliance for SoCal Innovation, so people can find that. If people want to find you, I'll just tell you they can find you on LinkedIn. You're always out there on LinkedIn, and you're pretty active there. So, but thank you, buddy. It was really a joy.
Yeah, no, it was my pleasure, and I just want to riff off your last thought. Is that when I think about research, they're very focused downwards, and that's how they solve fundamental science questions. But impact requires that you look across. You got to look horizontally. And I think innovation happens when that deeply verticalized view intersects, because it's generalists who can kind of get the players on the field. We need the breakthrough thinking to kind of provide that inspiration. And so this is kind of that cross-pollination that I think is so important to kind of, life-changing, life-solving innovation. And we need to be smart enough to listen for those breakthroughs, but also be able to translate that to the rest of the world. And, some of us get the pleasure, and I look forward to hopefully in the healthcare world, providing some leadership in that area. But Rob, it's always an absolute pleasure to spend time with you.
It's been great. When do you take off for New Zealand? Pretty soon, next week? Or?
Middle of December.
Okay.
My wife and kids found this trip when I was off on a trip with a friend, and my wife said, the kids are growing up. We need to lock in a few trips while we still have their attention.
Right.
And I said, she said, we're going to New Zealand. And I said, how did you end up on that? She said, the boys said they wanted to go a place where there are no museum and no museums and no cathedral, no churches. So we're doing a biking, hiking, whitewater.
Outdoor adventurers from Southern California to the coast of New Zealand. Good for you.
No museums, no cathedrals.
No, that's awesome. All right, buddy. It was awesome. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
Good to see you. Take care.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode as much as I did recording it. As always, we thank you so much for listening and watching. Today's show was recorded here in Los Angeles and produced by the incomparable Deanna Bernal in Mexico City. We can only grow this show by you listening and sharing the show with friends. So please find, follow, subscribe, and share our audio-only show on Spotify, Apple, or via any other popular podcasting platforms, as well as find the video version of our show now available on our YouTube channel over at Entrepreneurial Thinkers. And of course, you can follow along on our various social media platforms for fun and informative clips and content at Entrepreneurial Thinkers, wherever you can find us. And if you'd like to connect with me, you can find me at I Am Rob Ryan on just about any social media platform. Gracias, thank you, and have an awesome day.